I'm excited to be here as well. Thank you so much for this absolutely incredible privilege to be able to speak to all of the delegates in this symposium for 2023 for PATHSA. So I'm definitely excited to just be able to share what my reflections are on this very incredible theme. When I read what the theme was for the symposium, trials, tribulations, and triumphs, I got really excited. But then the task at hand became very apparent within seconds, and I had to sober up to the challenge of, as a transgender person who, in her own right, has continuously fought for the rights of other transgender persons using her own personal journey. What does this theme mean to me? And putting me in a space of having to really critically reflect on, I would definitely even say, the last 36 years of my life, and looking at the strides that we have made. Where is it that we still need to exert a bit of more effort? And out of that, still, what the kind of celebratory moments and those pockets of joy that can be found within the work in itself and within our lives? Where do those lie? And then even speaking that to the more professional side of all of us's work, how do we see the future? How do we envision it? And what is it that really we can be able to look forward to as part of what we are hopeful about? So in doing that, then I chose to unpack the theme under three categories and three sub-themes. First one, obviously having to look back at the trials and tribulations as just one area of my focus, but even as a point of departure, honestly. And then secondly, we come to looking at the triumphs, like I did say, those very pockets of joy, those moments of celebration, those moments of reprieve that we can be able to reflect on. And then lastly, I want to take us onto this thinking and space around what I call transcendence. And transcendence, in and of itself, by definition, looking at being able to elevate beyond just the very physical or the current status or status quo that a person currently occupies. So ideally, that's how then today's, what I believe is just a conversation starter, is going to be divided into those three particular sub-themes: trials and tribulations, triumphs, as well as transcendence. So jumping right into it, thank you so much, sis, Kawekazi, for that absolutely incredible introduction. Oftentimes, I do not own the fact that I do come from this royal household of the Barolong, of the Kgositaus, but because I think I've also, in my own right, had to have my own queendom. But definitely, I stand on shoulders of very strong clan of people. And I think I just need to jump right into it to speak to the fact that currently I am serving as the regional manager for Africa for the Global Equality Caucus, which is a global network of legislators that are geared towards enacting LGBTI reforms in order to, through law and policy, to be able to attain LGBTI equality and equality for all in the most of universal of sense. And that work ideally continuously puts me in direct contact and engagement with legislators ranging from MPs to senators to even traditional leaders who are custodians of customary law, as well as all other different levels of elected government and political office, inclusive of municipalities, inclusive of local government, inclusive of provincial legislature in and of itself, ranging across the entire globe. But my work in this essence has been to initiate a footprint of the Global Equality Caucus on the African continent and developing and cultivating a cohort of legislators that are not just interested in LGBTI related matters, but really have shown to be champions and have actually put themselves forward to be utilized in the quest for LGBTI equality, inclusion, and dignity. So currently preparing even for next week a major convening, which is the first of its kind. We have about 30 legislators from the region that will be meeting in Johannesburg under the auspices of launching this very African chapter of a global equality network in Africa. And that is rallying under the banner of African legislators for equality as a tag that we are working towards creating a community of practice of legislators such as your Ephraim Kayembe in Malawi, your Fox Odoi in Uganda, who voted recently against the very atrocious LGBTI anti-homosexuality bill that was passed in Uganda. You have people like Esther Passaris from Kenya. You've got people like Unity Dao from South Africa. You've got people like Honorable Kate Bilankulu from South Africa that are really convening to say, how do we move the needle? How do we shift the discourse? What ways can we be used as legislators sitting at the policy tables and the legislative tables to be able to make strides for LGBTI related matters on the continent? So when we talk about trials and tribulations, definitely we cannot do that without having to lament just quite recently what we got to witness across the continent sweeping as a wave of anti-homosexuality legislation and its tactics that when you get to even unpack further, you get to now to the core of how anti-gender movements globally have really permeated spaces that we have often advanced universal human rights. We have always advanced health and health equity, for instance, and we've often advanced social justice just within a short space of time. Hence, we saw Uganda passing the anti-homosexuality bill just recently in May this year against all forms of backlash and against all forms of sanctions that still went on to pass to become law. And that is a moment for us to be able to reflect critically, because it becomes easy for us to also look at anti-homosexuality bills as those that just affect the greater LGP part of the LGBTI movement. But it is important to recognize that within this very continent, it is the transgender and gender diverse individuals that are often bearing the brunt of most of these laws, because of the fact that transgender persons are more visible and on the front lines, and for that very matter, are often the easier pickings and easier targets for when some of these very anti-homosexuality bills really are passed. And as such, we cannot sit and not reflect with lament over the passing of some of these kind of laws. Needless to say how this is absolutely connected to the anti-women's rights movement and its tactics. This is connected to anti-civic liberties. This is also definitely connected to the anti-democracy kind of initiatives that we've seen across the whole entire region in and of itself, that are continuously threatening, if not having already done so, to regress all of the kind of progress that we have made over the years. I mean, for instance, when taking back my own life and just taking a bit of a step back, in 2017, I won a monumental constitutional matter against the government of Botswana. I often get tired of these days to talk about it, because to me personally, it feels like it was a phase of my life. But I acknowledge the very fact that that in and of itself was not just an easy win for an individual, but it was an entire process of having to have constitutional interpretation, so that then the rights of transgender Botswana specifically, because the matter was in the High Court of Botswana, and for transgender persons to be able to self-determine, for transgender persons and gender diverse persons to be able to live dignified lives and to be treated as equal citizens in their own country as other non-trans citizens within the state in and of itself. And thereby we were setting jurisprudence and case law within the continent when we won that very case that resulted in my gender market absolutely then getting to be amended in that essence. But we have to lament the fact that to this very point, we still do not have a gender recognition policy in a country like Botswana. Having set the kind of jurisprudence, having gotten the kind of affirmation in terms of the interpretation of the court, in terms of the rights of transgender persons that are contravened by a lack of legal protections and legal recognition, therefore. And to this very point that in 2023, we still do not have that gender policy in itself in place. And this is why I guess at the same time, I'm very excited about the work that I do of working directly with legislators from a technical perspective on how we can better craft gender recognition policy, for instance, feathering where, for instance, South Africa has already placed us. And I know for sure that the alteration of sex description and Sex Status Act is by far not necessarily the most global of gold standard, but definitely we want to be able to work from a place of building that on which that already exists on the continent and within the region in and of itself. But it is important to continuously lament the very slow turnaround in implementing and effecting such kind of judgments that come from our court systems that over the past couple of years have shown sympathy, empathy, and non-partisan when it comes to the rights of LGBTI persons greatly, but even on transgender individuals across the region. It is definitely a point of lament when we also have to reflect, as we talk about our trials and tribulations, the number of growing trans-specific murders globally. There's been more than 500 anti-LGBTI bills, for instance, that were introduced through state legislature. If you look at the United States, for instance, as we broaden the conversation even more globally, just in this year in and of itself, with many of them that are targeting the transgender community. And according to the American Civil Liberties Union, and there's more than 80 of them that were passed into law out of these very 500 bills that we're speaking about. And to this very record, the Human Rights Campaign actually laments that this is absolutely the record-breaking number of bills that have been introduced against our community and against already vulnerable communities. Because as you look globally, the statistic is absolutely, absolutely jarring. Looking at the number of murders or brutal murders, transphobic murders of transgender persons globally that continuously go unremedied. And South Africa is no different as we continuously see a lot of these cases coming to the fore. Part of what I reflected a little bit, moving away from those that are a bit morbid, was just also around this growing. Somebody the other day, as I was preparing for this keynote at the other foundation, which is where I am based as they are a part of the implementing partners to the Global Equality Caucus, spoke about us being the alphabet soup. Somebody needs to mute. Somebody just needs to mute. Sorry. Thank you. So somebody in the foundation said to me, Ricki, do you reckon that this growing alphabet of our alphabet soup of ours that we continuously are adding new letters into it and all these ingredients as we're making it, does it work to our advantage or does it actually work to our detriment? And I had to take a little bit of a step back. Firstly, I recognize the importance for us to continuously flame our space, for us to continuously create space to acknowledge the growing diversity within us as society generally. And I think it is important for that reason that other individuals that do not embody the experiences that some of us do carry need to be able to take a moment to be able to self-educate. And to self-educate requires for us to put a label to things, and it requires for us to be able to actually put categories that then allow them to be able to understand what diversity really is made up of. But then I had to sit back as well because I happen to also come from just greater society and more especially a family that for me, I happen to be one of the very few queer persons within, and they had to grapple with the concept of raising me into this girl when I was still a little girl. And for that very reason, I know for sure how they often struggled. Others will say LGBTIQ, others will say LBTQ. It is growing. We went from an LGBT to LGBTI to LGBTIQ to LGBTIQAP+, and it is growing. And the discomfort that I've often found is where it feels as if we further alienate individuals that we are trying to bring close, because then the ever-growing acronym has not necessarily given a lot of people opportunity to catch up, but I do believe that the onus is on them to have to catch up in all honesty. But in terms of the work and responsibility some of us have taken on with this work as a calling to the individual, it is important to continuously do that education as well. But I do recognize that many other persons also feel dissuaded to keep up with the ever evolving nature of our own community as we continuously are figuring out how to exist in a world that designed itself not to have us in it. So for that very reason, I feel like that is still a little bit of a trial that is up in front of us, not necessarily a tribulation, but a trial in front of us of how do we not further alienate our target audiences when we continuously are also affirming ourselves and continuously defining ourselves and continuously figuring ourselves in terms of the existence within greater society. There's a growing, obviously, or rather a sustained misconception around gender affirming healthcare as being cosmetic. As somebody who had to pay for my own affirmation process out of pocket, where it was not covered by any medical aid, it was not covered by a government, and it certainly was not something that was given as a gift. I totally lament the fact that we still have to see many a transgender person having to resort to, within the region more especially, having to resort to self-medication, for instance, wherein there is no access to gender affirming healthcare, no access to hormonal treatment, no access to gender affirming surgeries. And that for me is a point of lamentation, because I do not think that sitting at this point in time where the ICD-11 has come and kicked into effect, we ought to still be having to find a scenario where we are still battling to find a placing for gender affirming healthcare within broader and general and basic healthcare in and of itself. And I think that there is a lot that needs to be done. Private medical health providers and aides need to be taken to task about this in order to be able to make sure that they also continuously then reflect the kind of global health standards, particularly around the administration of healthcare to transgender persons. And more so that the WHO signed into effect this ICD-11 as a way of being able to reform the ways in which we have often looked at gender affirming healthcare, but more poignantly, how we've always looked at gender identity, expression, as well as body affirmation processes that transgender persons should go through, and categorizing and placing those in a new chapter that allows us to be able to look at gender affirming healthcare as a part of what should be the broader complementary scope of services that are provided on a sexual and reproductive health level. We have continuously seen the growing backlash. One of the most shocking experiences of my life in the close to 2 decades I've been doing this work was witnessing just in this year in and of itself far extreme religious groups which are evangelical, or more especially in the Botswana context, galvanizing to be able to push back at some of the reforms that were being proposed towards that obviously came as an instruction of the court, striking sections 164 and 167 within the Penal Code of Botswana, for instance, was long supposed to have been done back in 2021 when decriminalization of same-sex sexual conduct was actually struck off as being unconstitutional. But we continuously are seeing now how religious groups in Botswana, in Malawi, in Namibia are actually organized to continuously push back at some of the reforms. We noticed that in Namibia when the Supreme Court then took a judgment on the solemnization of same-sex marriage, well, the recognition of marriages that have been solemnized elsewhere outside of the Namibian jurisdiction as needing to be recognized internally. And what that then elicited was this religious backlash that ultimately has resulted in now the most regressive kind of move by legislature in Namibia to now actually go and reform and make the Marriage Act in and of itself more discriminatory and exclusionary of any other individuals that do not fall well within the cis-het kind of spectrum that most of legislation is often actually designed around. And lastly, definitely, it's important to lament the fact that there is a very slow implementation of the very ICD 11 that at this point in time grants us opportunity now having gender identity and expression and trans identities and how they should be rendered to healthcare in a very beautiful chapter that allows us to advance a case for comprehensive SRH services inclusive of gender affirming healthcare as a part of those complementary services. And for that very reason, there is more that needs to be done in order to ensure that then most of our countries and most of professionals in our countries within the region are actually able to accede to what are now the new prescriptions that come and recommendations that come with the ICD 11 in and of itself, because it presents opportunity for us to be able to now begin to advance a case for gender affirming healthcare being accessible, at least at a secondary healthcare level within the region in and of itself. But there are some pockets of hope in that essence. As I move on to my next segment, I definitely will be speaking a little bit around those in terms of transcendence as we look at the future and what we're hoping for. It is not all gloom and dark, because there are triumphs that we can be able to speak about. Just recently with the South African Human Rights Commission, having rendered the existing school policies and education policy, particularly around school uniforms, being very discriminatory. That came out of its Eastern Cape division, that in and of itself then presents us for the first time with an opportunity to just take a moment to breathe. I remember when I was still the executive director of Gender Dynamics some years back, part of the work that we did was to work in tandem with the Department of Basic Education to really work at creating at least a manual. I remember it was titled South African Transgender in South African Schools, that was designed as a tool for primary points of contact in schools on how to be able to handle gender diverse pupils and students within an educational setting. And to be able to see in this very 2023 such a determination come to pass, I feel honored, I feel proud of the kind of contributions that my own legacy has had in being able to get us to this very point, because Gender Dynamics does incredible work that I'm proud to look back and say, this is some of what we contributed to ensuring that there was sensitivity around the plight of trans and gender diverse pupils and learners within our educational, especially the public education system itself, that has always been designed in the most binary and very trans exclusionary manner, that then impeded obviously on the ultimate I would say performance, educational performance of trans and gender diverse learners in schools. So that is absolutely something that I feel that we ought to celebrate and say we are making strides. There's a long way to go, but these small wins are the pockets of reprieve that we ought to give ourselves and look back at all that we have done. Much as we do not have a gender recognition policy in a country like Botswana currently, a lot of my work through the Global Equality Caucus is to support legislators with technical support and technical expertise to be able to craft the best golden standard of some of these laws. And Botswana is well on its way in this very process, which I'm also a part of and involved with some of the local civil society actors on this side, and in partnership with the Ministry of Home Affairs, civil registration, as well as citizenship. And for that, for me, I see pockets of hope where South Africa will no longer exist as the only country in the near future within the region that is able to provide for legal gender recognition and gender marker change. We're seeing some of these efforts that are coming up in places like Lesotho, for instance, where I'm working with the Honorable Tshepang Mosena, who is the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, who is advancing about 10 cases of gender diverse individuals that have approached her office seeking remedy in that they have gone through their affirmation processes, but seek their gender markers to be amended to reflect that, and for them to live dignified lives. And to have a deputy speaker who's committed to the fact that before the next elections, which I think should be around 2027, He wants to have made sure that these matters have been resolved, and working in tandem with the Global Equality Caucus and the Ministers of Health and the Minister of Home Affairs in Lesotho to be able to ensure that then this process becomes seamless, which means that it needs to then be etched into policy. So that's some of the developments that are also great triumphs that are also hope for the future that we are going to be working towards. I sit with so much of hats on my head in different times, and I often have to remember this. And I am proud of another hat I get to wear. I am a part of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa's Connectional LGBTI Task Team. And the Connectional LGBTI Task Team is the task team that reports to the presiding bishop, who is the overseer bishop of all the bishops of the different synods of the church. And it has been the body that I've been serving on since 2019 that has been driving a lot of the transformation within the Methodist Church in and of itself. I'm here in front of you as somebody who is in the process of candidating towards ministry within the Methodist Church, specifically clear about the fact that I'm called to queer ministry and I subscribe to queer theology. And in so doing, I have gotten processes that have continuously build me up as different stages and steps that get me towards ultimately becoming an ordained minister of word and sacrament within the church. But a lot of that work has been done with me proudly and boldly having to step up to the plate to say, I am a transgender person that is actually called into ministry, and not just a transgender person of faith, and wanting the church to be able to decide what it does about a person like myself, more especially given that in previous we have seen the church itself and many other some of these mainline churches having actually excluded and excommunicated some of its queer clergy. But I am happy at this point in time that we are implementing a 2019 resolution of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa to transform the whole of the church across Southern Africa, which makes the connection of Southern Africa. So across the connection in and of itself, one, to become a very celebratory, open, and safe spiritual home for LGBTI persons, and place where ministerial formation for queer clergy, for trans clergy, can be done in the most safe and dignified and respectful of manner. And lastly, that we then build a church that is able to really stand firm on its social justice principles and its social justice commitment. And what has that resulted in? We saw just recently when in May, in the Botswana context, when there was that backlash against the amendment of the penal code to strike down homosexuality permanently within the penal code in and of itself, we saw the Methodist Church of Southern Africa issue its clear position and articulating how it is not a discriminatory church and it is a church in the body of love. And as such, anybody else who advances a discriminatory and unjust kind of discourse cannot call themselves Methodist. And they did likewise in the Namibia Synod the other day when the evangelical churches actually galvanized against the Supreme Court's decision. And for that very reason, this is absolutely telling that we are within a moment and a time where even shifts, there's a wave of shift within religious fraternity, within the faith community. And that is something that really needs to be celebrated because we understand fully how religious values and principles often govern some of our social values as well as legislative principles and initiatives. And as such, that's a moment where we ought to be able to say, these are triumphs. It is just a battle, but the war is still at hand that we need to actually win ultimately. But such battles are important to recognize as moments of triumph. I'm proud as well with the legacy that I left at one of the organizations I've been with, as I mentioned, Gender Dynamics before, where in the time and in my tenure as executive director, we then instituted what now has become a very growing programming around gender affirming healthcare trainings within the region, which have ultimately now resulted in this growth of access points to gender affirming healthcare for transgender and gender diverse people within the region. Gender affirming healthcare on a private level, however, is accessible in Botswana. It is accessible as well in Lesotho. So as we continuously are lamenting this 25-year waiting period for transgender persons to affirm themselves within a South African context, for instance, elsewhere within the region, we are seeing a growth of interested healthcare providers who want to be able to render these kind of services. We will have won the war when these services are accessible at a basic public health level, but we also need to recognize these as triumphs, because a lot of transgender and gender diverse people have had to continuously migrate from their countries of they call home to come to South Africa in order to be able to find ways to affirm themselves and live dignified lives. And to have this growth of access to gender-affirming healthcare tells us that ultimately we can be able to see a lot of us being able to still remain productive in the countries that we get to call home and not having to relocate just to be able to affirm ourselves. There's a lot of visibility we have seen as well of transgender and gender diverse persons within the region. I want to just speak to, for instance, the South African context, where we've seen a lot of media portrayal and visibility of transgender persons on some of these mainstream shows called Becoming, for instance, which follows the lives of transgender individuals as they go through that process of transition and affirmation, and just the kind of trials and tribulations that comes with. We have seen how entities such as the Feather Awards continuously now are recognizing trans excellence, as I can put it, where recently, just this year, I saw about 3 transgender individuals walking away with awards on that very evening, which is just recently in October. We have seen, even just with, for instance, your Miss Universe pageants, for instance, Miss Universe, where just in this year itself, the recent Miss Universe, we witnessed as well about 2 trans-identified women that were able to participate on those kind of stages. And for those that love pageants, that is a moment of triumph, considering how far these particular spaces have often been exclusionary to transgender women. And for that reason, to even see the Miss Universe pageant itself, or Miss Universe organization, even currently owned by a transgender woman, those are triumphs that are telling us that we are indeed taking up space and cementing ourselves, like Zozibini Tunzi, Miss Universe 2019 would say to any girl child. The reform of the Marriage Act in South Africa, for me, gives a lot of hope. It is encouraging to be able to see the move to now be able to create a very inclusive and equitable marriage law in the South African context, because I remember back in the day as well, in the time that I was with Gender Dynamics, we had a lot of litigation that we took on around cases of transgender individuals who were married in the old marriage regime or act before the civil union and transitioned while in marriage, and being forced by the state and the system to have to be forcibly divorced just because of the fact that the system did not recognize those kind of marriages. So to getting there, for me, is not just a win for all other persons in terms of amalgamating all statutes that regulate access to marriage and committed relationshiping, but it's a major one for transgender persons. When I remember back in the day, when I was at Gender Dynamics, about 2 cases we were handling of couples that were forced by the system to divorce and to go and re-register or remarry under the Civil Union Act, which was absolutely arbitrary, none to say even very violent. And lastly, the decision by the Supreme Court of Namibia is one that gives us hope. It might be on same-sex marriages, but you will remember that Namibia is also grappling with the case related to the adoption of children by same-sex couples and queer individuals outside of Namibia. And for that, when a court system outside of Botswana, outside of South Africa, is able to show us that it is indeed independent enough to rule on such kind of matters in the positive for LGBTI persons, it is telling for us that even more gender recognition cases and litigation can be mounted in other parts of the region, where we can continuously build a body of such kind of work. So now when we look into the future, as I ask us to transcend, when I'm asking us to look at what is this transcendence that Ricki Kgositau is talking about, I want us to be able to look at this growing cohort of trans and queer political figures. Within the region, a lot of my work is directly with legislators, sitting legislators, and even former legislators. But there's a pocket of work that I'm very excited about that I am pushing to resource, which is this queer political school of excellence that is working to be able to strengthen the capacity of many of us to be able to run for elected office and political office at some point. We're seeing people like Steve Litsike in South Africa, Tebogo Panama Kwati in the Northern Cape. We're seeing people like Sheriff Motopeng in Lesotho, people like Gift Trapens in Malawi, people like Danilo da Silva in Mozambique, people like Jennifer Henshaw in Liberia, all whom are queer individuals and some of them trans non-binary that have actually put themselves forward to be elected into official office and capacity as political figures. And that for me is a moment for us to actually concert our hope onto the fact that when we look at the point of 2030, where the world will be evaluating whether we've done well on our developmental agenda setting, looking at the sustainable development goals, looking at Agenda 2063 for the continent itself, to be able to look back and say, we did not in 2023 have political figures that are trans and gender diverse, but now we do. And what does that mean? It spells hope for us to be able to have our own meaningful representation sitting within legislative hallways. There's a growing cohort of queer theologians and trans religious leaders. I happen to be one that is in formation at this very point in time, and I'm affiliated to many others within the very connection in and of itself that gives us hope that there is a tomorrow where transgender persons will no longer just be bashed with the Bible and being told that we have absolutely desecrated the temple of the Lord, but where we can be able to have some of us being able to even minister to our own community. And by that virtue, we've seen a lot of trans documentaries, a lot of trans memoirs, a lot of trans narratives that are coming from the region that give us hope in terms of the visibility that ultimately will then garner us the kind of at least acknowledgement of our existence, that we exist, and as such, we ought to be programmed for, we ought to be protected, we ought to have our rights also protected, and we ought to live dignified lives like everybody else. And it is for that reason that we've seen a lot as well when we talk about what has given me a lot of hope around social enterprising and philanthropy, where a lot of us have gone into social enterprising as a way to continuously be able to provide for some economical justice for ourselves and our communities and our own movements, but also to be able to continuously create and generate wealth. I'm sorry, I need to be honest in saying that I'm now sitting at a place where I feel like we need to be building our own trans billionaires. We need to be building our own trans business women, for instance. I happen to have registered the Ricki Kgositau Foundation, through which I do a lot of these kind of engagements and a lot of facilitation of processes as a way of being able to use this kind of experience and live reality that I come with to be able to help other entities that wish to be more transformative and to be able to become much more inclusive for gender diverse individuals. And as such, that for me gives me hope, where we can be able to see. I saw in the Eswatini context, where I went to meet with Honorable Ngumalo that side, how she's working directly with one of the queer organizations just to be able to provide sanitary wear through schoolgirls, to make sure that then girls and other persons that actually do need sanitary wear can be able to access those and stay in school, which is absolutely fantastic. We've seen a lot of transparenting, and I don't even want to go deeper into it because we have seen a lot of transgender persons and gender diverse people who have founded families, who have taken up that space that for the longest time we were told we couldn't be able to occupy, and continuously then demystifying the fears that continuously exist around whether us as transgender persons raising little humans to become amazing human beings was even a possibility. That gives me hope to be able to see many other individuals in future who would be able to speak about their own parents' trans journey and trans experience. And what that does, it continuously creates that space and realm for acceptance, space for recognition, and as such, those that we recognize, we are able to do a lot more in order to make their lives absolutely dignified. Funny enough, as I come to my conclusion, we have seen in the region how the trans movement has become the anchor of the greater LGBTI movement. I was a part of the individuals that founded an entity called the Southern Africa Trans Forum, the SATF, which is still alive and kicking at this point in time, albeit many other anchor movements having died and perished. I mean, we can lament the fact that organizations such as the African Men for Sexual Health and Rights, AMSHA, has died. we should definitely lament the fact that the Coalition of African Lesbians has died when it had done incredible work to be able to push for observer status at the African Union, at the African Union Commission, pardon me. And at this point in time, it seems that the trans movement is the only torchbearer that remains, anchoring even the greater LGBTI movement. Talking about transcendence, I think that is definitely that. Ultimately, last and certainly not least, I have been absolutely inspired by journeys of people and icons such as Caster Semenya, who just released her memoir just recently. But the war that Caster mounted against international federations that regulate sporting codes, and having to challenge and push back at this continuous discrimination of elite athletes, as they're called, as we are called, or even further to that, the continued exclusion of transgender persons within international sporting codes, for me, gives me hope that we are having the conversation and we are not dying and wilting silently in a corner, but that we're pushing back and we're claiming our space, and we are actually fighting in order to say no. What has been the norm is not right, it is not just, it is not fair, and as such should not be the case in today's modern world. And for that, it gives us hope that many other younger Caster Semenians can be able to continuously challenge some of these bodies in order to be able to ensure that then transgender and gender diverse persons can also take space in any kind of occupation, in any kind of sporting code, which for me tells me I need to elevate from the current lament of our trials and tribulations while we are celebrating those triumphs, but to look to the future and with hope that indeed a time shall come where my younger siblings, trans siblings, and gender diverse siblings would be able to participate in any sporting code or any field of industry that they wish to be in. And for that, thank you so much to everybody who's given me this time and their ears and your listening mind. With that, I will close at this very point in time. Thank you so much.